The cold November air held a charge of frantic energy, a collective breath held until the stroke of midnight. Outside the monolithic bulk of the Everett and Grand department store, a sea of people shifted and pressed against the glass doors, their reflections a mosaic of determined faces under the harsh parking lot lights. For weeks, the flyers had promised impossible deals, doorbusters that sparked a low-grade fever in the town. Now, on the cusp of Black Friday, the fever broke into a frenzy. Among the crowd, Maya clutched her thin coat tighter, her eyes fixed on the store's grand entrance. The image of her daughter's face, lit with hope for the sold-out Glitter Galaxy dollhouse, was a physical ache in her chest. She had promised. Just behind her, Ben and Leo jostled each other, their phone held aloft to capture the spectacle. They narrated the scene in hushed, excited tones for a vlog they'd ironically titled Consumption Carnage. It was a lark, a way to kill a boring holiday break. And near the edge of the throng, a man in a nondescript beige coat stood perfectly still, his hands buried in his pockets, his gaze not on the doors but on the people around him, observing with the quiet focus of a cataloger. A deep metallic clunk echoed through the frosty air as the great doors unlocked. For one suspended second, there was silence. Then, with a roar that swallowed the night, the crowd surged forward. Maya was swept off her feet for a terrifying moment, carried along on a tide of elbows and shopping bags. The store's interior, a cavern of garish holiday displays and relentless fluorescent light, swallowed the mob whole. The air grew thick with the smell of new carpet and desperate ambition. The initial rush was a brutal ballet of grabbing and shoving. In electronics, a loud man in a bright red jacket wrestled a flat-screen television from another shopper, his victorious shout cutting above the din. He heaved the box into his cart with a grunt of triumph and barreled. Down aisle 6, his progress a wake of disgruntlement. Ben and Leo weaved through the chaos, Leo filming the absurdity, a woman with 3 microwaves, a group sprinting toward small appliances as if their lives depended on it. They laughed, the sound thin and nervous against the backdrop of greed. The man in the beige coat moved with unsettling grace against the current, pausing once to straighten a display of kitchen towels that had been ruffled in the stampede. The first shift in the atmosphere was subtle. The frantic energy began to curdle into something confused. Near the end of aisle 6, a cluster of people had stopped, forming a loose circle around an abandoned shopping cart. It lay on its side, the large flat-screen box spilled onto the floor. The loud man in the red jacket was gone. Not moved on, not in the next aisle arguing, gone. His absence was a sudden, cold pocket in the store's feverish heat. People glanced around, their acquisitive fervor momentarily doused. Primitive unease. One woman pointed a shaky finger at the scuffed linoleum where the cart had fallen, but there was nothing to see. No sign of a struggle, no trail. Just an empty space where a boisterous, victorious man had been seconds before, and a profound, silent vacancy that now seeped into the bright, noisy air. The unease left by the vanished man in aisle 6 did not dissipate, it fermented. The store's vastness, once a promise of plenty, now felt like a labyrinth with unseen walls. The initial shopping frenzy had fractured into smaller, quieter clusters of people who cast frequent, nervous glances over their shoulders. It was into this simmering quiet that the lights first failed. It was not a total blackout, but a long, shuddering dimming that swept through the ceiling fluorescence in a wave, starting in home goods and rolling like a silent tide through linens and into the heart of the store. The tubes buzzed, flickered, and died for 3 long seconds, plunging entire. Sections into a gloom pierced only by the relentless cheer of holiday LED displays. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a louder, more confused murmur when the lights stuttered back to full, sterile brightness. The incident felt deliberate, a massive inhalation and exhalation of the building itself. Ben and Leo had retreated to a relatively calm corner near sporting goods. Leo's hands were shaking, though he tried to play it off. "Dude, did you see that?" Probably just the grid overloading, but Ben wasn't listening. He was staring at his phone, the chaotic footage from their initial entry playing back on the small screen. He scrolled, his thumb trembling slightly, back to the moment near electronics. He zoomed in on the periphery of the frame, just behind the spot where the loud man had been celebrating his stolen television. As the man turned to push his cart away, Ben saw it. For a single frame, a blurred, elongated shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness. Between the shelves, it was not a human shape, but a smear of impossible speed and density, arcing behind the man just as he moved out of shot. It was there, and then it was gone, so fast Ben almost doubted his own eyes. He replayed it, slowing the footage to a crawl. The shadow persisted, a flaw in the digital reality, a silent predator caught in the act of pursuit. "We need to find security," Ben said, his voice low. They found 2 overwhelmed guards near customer service, their radios crackling with static and frantic, disjointed reports. Ben shoved his phone toward them, pointing at the shadow. The older guard, a man with tired eyes and a too-tight uniform shirt, barely glanced at it. "Kid, it's midnight on Black Friday. The cameras are glitching, the lights are glitching, people are running everywhere. It's a blur, probably a shopper in a dark coat." His dismissal was absolute, a wall of weary indifference. The other guard was arguing with a man claiming his wife was lost, his voice rising in panic. The guards were anchors in a storm they refused to acknowledge was anything but a busy night. Maya had become separated from the group of mothers she'd arrived with. The flickering lights had scattered them, and now she was alone in the maze of the children's clothing section, the tiny sequined dresses and miniature jeans taking on a sinister, mockingly cheerful air. She was looking for a shortcut back to toys when she heard it, a wet, ragged sound from above. She froze. It was breathing slow and labored, as if from a large, tired animal. It came from the top stock shelf, a metal grid piled high with extra boxes of pajamas, shrouded in shadow 10 feet above the floor. The sound did not belong in this temple of commerce. It was organic, pained. Maya stood paralyzed, her eyes scanning the dark lattice of the shelf. Nothing moved. Then a soft click on the linoleum by her foot. She looked down. A single button lay on the floor. It was large, made of aged brass with an intricate, worn design etched into its surface, a stylized E and G encircled by laurel leaves. She picked it up. It was cold, and unlike the simple plastic buttons on the current store staff's red vests, this spoke of an older, heavier uniform, a relic. As she pocketed the unsettling find, her gaze drifted across the wide central aisle. There, in the meticulously organized world of kitchenware, stood the quiet man in the beige coat. He was calmly selecting a stainless steel measuring cup from a shelf, examining it under the light, and then placing it back with exacting precision. He did not look rushed or concerned. His movements were economical, serene. As he turned to leave the aisle, his hands came into view. They were impeccably, almost unnaturally, clean. No dirt, no smudges, no trace of the night's chaos. They were the hands of a surgeon or a preparer, and in that moment, their pristine state seemed more alarming than any amount of grime. He disappeared around an end cap, leaving behind a perfect row of cookware and a silence that felt heavier than before. The customer service booth was a forgotten island in the rising sea of panic. Its sliding plexiglass windows were shut and locked, the closed sign hanging crookedly. Ben spotted it from across the main concourse, a semi-enclosed space with a bank of dark monitors visible through the glass. It represented order, a control room, however small. He grabbed Leo's arm and pointed, and without a word they began pushing through the dwindling, anxious crowds toward it. The door at the side was miraculously unlocked. They slipped inside, the sudden quiet a physical relief. The air smelled of stale coffee and dust. Ben slid the bolt home behind them, the solid thunk a tiny bastion of safety. The main console was a relic, a metal desk holding a chunky keyboard and 4 black and white monitors. 3 were dark, but the 4th flickered with a live feed, a grainy, top-down view of aisle 9. It was empty. Okay. Okay, Leo breathed, collapsing into the worn swivel chair. We're good, we're safe here, we can see him coming. But Ben's mind was on the blurry shadow, the pristine hands of the quiet man, the button Maya had found. This booth was a nexus. It had eyes. He leaned over Leo's shoulder, his finger hovering over the keyboard. Can you scroll? Other cameras. Leo fumbled with the keys. Image on the live feed changed with a static jump, a view of the main entrance, now showing a confused crowd pressing against the doors from the inside. Another keystroke, the toy section where a lone figure, Maya, perhaps ducked behind a towering display. Another, the stockroom entrance, a heavy metal door slightly ajar, darkness pooling beyond it. There's an archive menu, Ben muttered, pointing to a line of faded text at the bottom of the screen. Maybe there's a log of the glitches. Leo navigated to it. A directory tree appeared, listing dates going back decades. The system was ancient, a digital fossil. On a whim, Ben pointed to a date 20 years prior. The day after Thanksgiving. Try that. Leo clicked. The live feed vanished, replaced by a playback screen. The timestamp read NOV24:00:47 a.m. The footage was monochrome, grainier, the aspect ratio boxy. It showed a stockroom, but not the modern one. The shelves were wooden, the boxes older, the lighting a single bare bulb casting deep, sharp shadows. The camera angle was high in a corner. For a moment the scene was still. Then a young man in a uniform, the same heavy jacket with the ornate brass buttons, stumbled into frame. He was maybe 19, his face pale with fear. He was backing away, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. 3 older men in suits and ties, managers, by their bearing, entered the frame after him. They moved with a cold, coordinated purpose, herding him deeper into the stockroom, away from the door. The young employee was pleading, his mouth moving silently on the mute footage. One manager, a large man with a severe part in his hair, shook his head slowly. Another gestured angrily at a stack of open boxes near the wall. Ledgers and loose cash were visible, spilling out. A theft, a discovery. The young man was shaking his head, desperately denying something. The large manager moved first. It was not a punch of rage, but a brutal, efficient blow to the stomach, doubling the boy over. The other 2 joined in. The violence was methodical, horrific in its silence. They were not beating him in a frenzy. They were dismantling him, working with the grim efficiency of men closing a ledger. The young man crumpled, trying to curl into a ball. A kick landed against his ribs, another against his head. His body went limp. The managers stood over him for a moment, their chests heaving. They exchanged looks, then the large one nodded. Two of them bent, grabbed the boy under the arms, and dragged his lifeless form out of the frame, toward the back wall where the shadows were deepest. Third manager began gathering the spilled cash and ledgers. He looked up once, directly at the camera, a cold, calculating glance before turning back to his task. Then the footage cut to black. Ben and Leo stared, their breaths shallow in the silent booth. The grainy horror of the silent film had imprinted itself on the air. A cover-up, a murder, in this very store or the one that stood here before. Play the live feed again, Ben whispered, his throat tight. The stockroom, now. Leo's fingers trembled as he exited the archive. The screen flickered back to the present. He selected the camera for the modern stockroom entrance. The metal door was still ajar. For a second, nothing. Then a figure stepped into the frame from within the stockroom darkness. It was the quiet man in the beige coat. He stood just inside the threshold, his back to the camera. Then slowly he turned. He looked up, not at the door, not at the shelves, but directly into the lens of the security camera mounted. Above him, his face, previously neutral, relaxed into a smile. It was a small, terrible smile, devoid of warmth or humor. It was a smile of recognition, of someone seeing an old acquaintance. He held the gaze for a 3 count, his eyes seeming to find theirs through the miles of cable and the years of buried history. Then he took a single, smooth step backward, melting into the absolute blackness of the stockroom. He did not reappear. The old store, Ben breathed, the pieces crashing together. They built this new one right on top of the old foundation. He never left. He's been here the whole time. The booth, which had felt like a refuge moments before, now felt like a glass coffin, its monitors showing them a past that was violently, insistently present. The grainy smile from the stockroom feed seemed to hang in the air of the service booth, a silent verdict. Before Ben or Leo could move, before they could even form a coherent thought, the world snapped shut, the fluorescent. Lights didn't flicker this time. They died. Every last one of them, from the grand chandeliers over cosmetics to the utilitarian tubes in the back aisles, winked out in a simultaneous, absolute cessation. The store was plunged into a blackness so complete it felt solid. For a heartbeat, there was a vacuum of sound, a collective intake of shock. Then the screams began, raw, unfiltered terror tearing through the dark. Dim, blood-red emergency lights stuttered on along the baseboards and above the distant exits, casting long, grotesque shadows that transformed familiar aisles into cavernous gullets. The cheerful holiday music was gone, replaced by the frantic, echoing chaos of trapped shoppers. Ben and Leo were blind in their booth, the monitors now dark glass. The only illumination was the sickly red glow seeping under the door. Leo, Ben whispered, groping in the dark. His hand found the back of the swivel chair. It was empty, still spinning slightly from Leo's sudden movement. The booth door, which Ben had bolted, was now ajar, a slice of crimson hallway visible. Leo must have unbolted it, must have stepped out to see. Ben lunged for the doorway. Leo, get back in here. He reached the threshold just in time to see it. A shape larger than a man and moving with a silent, fluid strength detached itself from the deeper shadows of the opposite wall. It was little more than a coalescence of the darkness, but Ben saw arms, pale, long, shoot out. They wrapped around Leo, who had been peering down the hall toward the main concourse. There was no shout, no struggle. A faint, choked gurgle was swallowed by the pandemonium around them. The shape yanked Leo backward with terrifying ease, his sneakers squeaking once against the linoleum before he was gone, vanished into a service corridor Ben hadn't even noticed, its door now swinging shut with a soft, final click. Ben stood frozen, his hand on the doorframe, the scream stuck in his throat. Gone. Just like the man in the red jacket snatched into the architecture of the place. The panic in the store reached a new, feverish pitch. People were running blindly, crashing into displays, their silhouettes against the red lights like figures in a hellish zoetrope. Somewhere, glass shattered. A child wailed, the sound abruptly cut off. The store was no longer a building. It was a living organism digesting them. Then a new sound cut through the bedlam. A sharp electric crackle, then a hum, emanating from the ancient PA speakers hanging from the ceiling. The hum resolved into a breath, calm and measured, and then a voice. It was hollow, devoid of resonance, as if coming from a great distance or a very deep place. It was the voice of the quiet man. "Good evening," the voice said, and the sheer normality of the greeting amidst the chaos was more frightening than any roar. The screams subsided slightly, people pausing in their flight, compelled by the eerie calm from above. "Thank you for your patience. An accounting is long overdue." In the toy section, Maya pressed herself into a fortress of stacked board game boxes, her heart hammering against her ribs. The red light made the plastic faces of dolls look demonic. 24 years ago, the hollow voice continued, conversational. My father, Samuel Carter, clocked in for his night shift in the stockroom of the old Everett and Grand. He was a good man, a careful man. He found discrepancies, not small ones. A systematic theft. Ledgers were written to hide the emptying of the pension fund by men in very nice suits. The voice paused, allowing the memory of the grainy tape to flood back for those who had seen it and to plant itself for those who had not. They called him into the stockroom. 3 of them. They said he'd been careless. They said he'd stolen. They offered him silence in exchange for his, but he wouldn't be silent. The voice didn't waver with emotion, it recited facts, so they silenced him. With their hands and their feet and their absolute certainty that they were the law here, they buried his body in the foundation pour for the new HVAC system. The next day, this brighter, bigger store was celebrated. Progress. Maya's hand closed around the brass button in her pocket. Her mind flashed to the tape Ben had described, the young man in the heavy jacket, the E and G design. It was a match. She was holding a piece of a murder victim's uniform. I grew up in the shadows this town built for me, the voice said, a hint of something cold and sharp finally entering its tone. In foster homes in the spaces between, watching this store, learning its rhythms, waiting for the one night a year when it is at its fullest, its most self-congratulatory, the night it celebrates the very consumption that justified my father's death for a few extra zeros on a balance sheet. A fresh wave of sobs and whimpers echoed through the aisles. The voice was hurting them, not with threats, but with a story that was tightening around them like a noose. Tonight, the speaker concluded, the hollow calm returning. The balance comes due. The doors are closed. The managers are gone, passed on from old age or luxury. But the store remains, and you are here spending your life and your spirit in its belly. So you will pay. You will settle their debt. The PA crackled and went dead, leaving only the red dark and the sounds of weeping. The reckoning had been declared. And in the suffocating silence that followed the announcement, the survivors trapped in the crimson gloom knew, with a certainty that chilled their blood, that the quiet man was no longer just watching. He was collecting. The hollow echo of the PA announcement seemed to seep into the very walls, a final pronouncement that left the remaining survivors in a state of paralyzed dread. In the toy section, Maya uncurled herself from behind the board games, her fingers still clenched around the cold brass button. It was a totem now, a direct line to the young face from the grainy tape. The voice on the speaker was that boy's son, the quiet man, the accountant of this terrible debt. Her thoughts were a frantic scramble. The main entrance was a maelstrom. She'd seen the crowd surging against it from a distance. The stockroom was a tomb, the killer's sanctum. There had to be another way, the loading dock. Every store had one, a concrete bay for trucks, usually at the rear with heavy rolling doors. It was a slim chance, but it was a direction other than the obvious, fatal trap. Moving in a low crouch, she navigated by the hellish glow of the emergency strips, her sneakers silent on the linoleum. She was nearing the shattered remains of the electronics department when a figure stumbled from behind a toppled display of headphones. Ben. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with a loss so fresh it looked like physical pain. He saw her and flinched, raising his hands as if to ward off another horror. He took Leo, Ben whispered, the words raw, from the doorway. Just took him. Maya didn't offer empty comfort. She gave him a focus. The loading dock, at the back, it's our only shot. Ben stared at her, the fog of shock in his eyes slowly clearing, replaced by a desperate need for purpose. He nodded once sharply. An alliance forged not in trust, but in the absolute absence of any other option. Together, they became ghosts in the red-lit maze. They avoided the open concourses where sobs and panicked whispers gathered. Instead, they slipped through the tight, cluttered aisles of the home improvement section, a canyon of paint cans and tools. The killer's voice had spoken of herding, of an accounting. Ben, his mind racing to keep ahead of the grief, pieced it together in a hushed murmur as they moved. He's using the store's layout. The PA, the lights, he's driving everyone toward the center, toward the back where the old stockroom was. It's the heart of it. That's where he wants us, where it happened. Maya thought of the ceremonial care in the old tape, the manager's methodical violence. He's not just killing, he's performing a ritual, settling the books. Their path to the rear of the store forced them to cross the wide main thoroughfare that ran behind the clothing departments. They paused at the mouth of an aisle, peering out. The space was clear, but at the far end, where the signs pointed to storage and receiving, they saw a shape. A person lying on the floor, then another, not strewn haphazardly but placed parallel to each other, arms neatly at their sides. A third shape was visible further down, positioned with the same chilling symmetry. It was a gallery of the debt already paid. They had to cross. Holding their breath, they scurried across the open space, their eyes locked on the distant, dark mouth of the corridor that promised the loading dock. They were halfway when a figure stepped out from between 2 racks of clearance coats, blocking the entrance to the corridor. The quiet man. He stood under a lone flickering red bulb, his beige coat seeming to absorb the scant light. He was not holding a weapon. His clean hands hung loosely at his sides. He simply watched them, his head tilted slightly as if observing interesting specimens under glass. Ben and Maya froze, their blood turning to ice. This was it. The end met in a narrow aisle of marked-down winter wear, but the man did not advance. His gaze traveled past them, to the arranged forms in the hallway behind him, then back to their faces. His expression was not one of rage, nor hunger, nor even satisfaction. It was one of profound, unsettling care. The bodies were not discarded, they were presented. Each was a unit of value, tallied against an ancient ledger. "The doors won't open," he said. His voice was the same as on the PA, hollow and close, yet it held a final, absolute truth. "Until the balance is paid." He made no move to stop them as they slowly, agonizingly backed away. He just stood, a silent sentinel in front of his grim work. He was not a hunter chasing prey. He was a gatekeeper, stating the rules of the temple. The payment was not complete. The account remained in arrears. Their retreat turned into a frantic sprint. They abandoned all stealth, pounding past empty registers and toppled mannequins, driven by a primal need to see the outside world. They rounded a final corner, and there it was, the bank of the store's main entrance. The grand, twin sets of glass doors, reinforced with decorative metal scrollwork. A handful of other survivors were there already, pounding on the glass, screaming into the night. Ben and Maya joined them, their hands slapping against the cold, unyielding surface. Outside was a different world. Flashing red and blue lights painted the parking lot in rhythmic pulses. Police cruisers were there, officers in bulky jackets moving with urgent purpose. But their attention was not on the people trapped inside. It was on the crowd, a smaller but still sizable and angry crowd. Pressed against the police line, their faces contorted with frustration. They were the latecomers, the ones who had arrived after the doors had sealed, demanding to be let in for the sales, unaware that the store had become a charnel house. The officers were trying to control them, to push them back, their backs to the store. From the outside, it must have looked like a typical Black Friday disturbance, a store so full it had to lock its doors, leading to a scuffle. Ben hammered on the glass until his fists ached. An officer glanced over, his face annoyed, and waved a dismissive hand. "Settle down in there." He didn't see the terror in their eyes. He didn't see the red emergency glow. He saw only another overexcited shopper. The doors were electronically sealed, deadbolts driven home with a finality that no amount of human strength could overcome. The killer's control was total. He had locked them in a vault with him. From a security camera mounted high in the vestibule ceiling, a silent, wide-angle lens captured the scene. The frame showed the backs of Ben and Maya, their postures slumped in defeat against the glass, the frantic reflections of police lights playing over them. It showed the other survivors dissolving into despair around them. And then, from the deep shadows of the main concourse behind them, a new shadow emerged. It lengthened, stretching across the polished floor toward the huddled figures at the door. The quiet man stepped into the edge of the frame, his beige coat a smear of neutrality against the chaos. He did not rush. He simply advanced, a patient creditor coming to collect the final, outstanding sum. The camera watched, unblinking, as the story of the town's buried crime reached its inexorable, unresolved conclusion within the bright, sealed tomb of commerce.